All right. Welcome to Zhengdao Lecture 7 of a series of 10 on the relational approach to psychotherapy. The particular title today, let's see if I can get my screen sharing up. There we go. The particular title today, okay, is going to be Relational Interventions with the Organizing Experience. I'm going to be using a lot of slides today and talking from the slides. And so Sammy has been good enough to arrange a translation for me. So just a quick review. This is my contact material information. If any of you need anything, you can call me or email me, or there's at the bottom, the Listening Perspectives website. Here's a web address you need to know: Free Psychotherapy Books. It's got about 150 books, many of them classic books in psychotherapy, and you can download them free. So you need to go to this website, take a look at it, and see what books you might want to download. There are 23 of my books on there now, and so it's really a wonderful website to know about. The beginning of all of this is in 1983, so we're now celebrating the 40th anniversary coming up of the foundational book here, Listening Perspectives in Psychotherapy. And that's where we first set up the four, the four ways of listening. And then they got summarized in a book that I actually wrote for Chinese students at Kappa, summarizing 40 years of the relational approach to psychotherapy. It's a short book. It's fairly easy to read. And it is, my books are all, like I say, on free download. And most of them are now also available on Amazon in paperback for $19. Here's the basic chart that we've been following the whole time. And we're looking here at ways of listening. And when we think of ways of listening, we think about when we have a child that's plus or minus 4 months from birth, an infant. We speak and listen to that infant in certain ways, mostly through our emotions and through our intentions. By the time the child is 4 to 24 months, we begin to speak to a child through various kinds of interactions. And by the time we get a 3-year-old, the 3-year-old child is needing to solidify the sense of self, and so needs a lot of affirmation from people around. And so if we're going to be working with someone who has an experience level of the 3 years of life, that's what we're doing. And the upper level is the one that Freud first set out, and Jung more than 100 years ago, the normal neurotic independence. And the independent level implies we're dealing with three-way love and hate relationships, and we're dealing with symbolization. And so it's an advanced form of storytelling. But at these other levels, they're more, the Cohen has taught us how at this level, the self-to-self object resonance is very important. And at the symbiotic level, the back and forth scenario is important. And at the organizing level, what we're continuing to talk about is the child in utero and the first ferments reaching and hoping that the world in some way or another is going to find, so that there is a connection, and these connections lead towards a symbiosis. But if the connection isn't made, the reaching child may wither, or the reaching child, if the connection gets hurt, they may constrict. And so whether there's a withering or a constricting, the main message on this level is never go there again. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. In expanding the chart of the 4 listening perspectives that have different developmental levels, there's the there are 7 fears. So here is the chart with the 4 in red and the 7 fears. There's fears for each one. And today we're going to be focusing on this, this lowest level, the organizing experience. And we're going to be looking at the fear of not being met and the fear of making connections. So that's going to be our look for today. Now, after our meeting last week, Zilly commented to me that in my lectures, I focused on these first 2 levels mostly without doing much on level 3 and 4. And that's absolutely correct. And the reason for it is that for more than 100 years, we've been working on level 4 with being able to talk, to interpret. So most of our psychotherapy experience is at level 4. And Heinz Kohut, along in the 1970s and 80s, and the self-psychologists set up ways of listening here to the narcissistic ones. But the ones that are the most difficult for us are the symbiotic ones that a number of people have been working on since the late 70s and 80s. But the most complex one that is not yet understood well in any of our training centers is this organizing experience. So I wanted to focus on these first 2 because they really rely on nonverbal relationships, and they are the most difficult one that therapists have. And if it looks like later we need to look more at level 3 and 4, well, we'll add another session and do it. It just depends on how we go. All right, so the book that this material is being taken from today is called Relational Interventions. It's in the free website. It's also available on Amazon for $19. And you can see that the subtitle is Treating Borderline, Bipolar, Schizophrenic, Psychotic, and Characterological Personality Disorders. We might also add there the autistic spectrum. And here are the 2 charts that you'll find in that book that go through a number of different dimensions that we look at. So first of all, I'd like to start off with just introducing the idea of relational listening. What are we talking about? So most clinicians today dread working with individuals who are diagnosed bipolar, schizophrenic, psychotic, borderline, character disordered, or autistic spectrum. That is, most therapists are aware that these are very difficult patients to be with, and so many people dread them. But my comment, you're going to see why today, is there's no need for such dread, and I'll explain to you why, because as we go along. Personalities of these people are organized in relatively simple relational modes that yield readily to therapeutic work. But the treating therapist must be able to grasp the nature of the personality organization involved in order to go with the flow and to eventually enjoy this person that's coming with one of these lower level early developmental fixations. So my point is this, that when we think of how many relational possibilities an infant has, they're relatively limited. And if you think about how it is to relate to an infant, it's a relatively simple task, but you have to be up for it. You have to have some understanding of what the infant can and cannot deal with. And so the same is true for these early organizing personalities. Another way to talk about these is the psychotic elements or the hidden psychoses. And I say that because many of the people we're talking about have had good brain, good gray matter. They've learned good speech patterns. They've often learned skills that put them higher up in the world. So we have people who are well placed in the social or business ladder, who talk very sophisticated, who seem very intelligent. But when we look at their relationship level, they're still at the earliest months of life. They have not yet learned how to actually reach out and interact with other people. And so essentially, the psychotic elements remain hidden from view. So one of the reasons why therapists have been so slow in grasping how to work with these lower level people is because at the outset, they usually don't look lower level. And so the therapist ends up being deceived. So after we finish here, I hope that you will no longer be deceived by patients who come to you looking good, well placed in the world, talking good, but then you begin to realize, wait a minute, when it comes to relating, they have no idea how to form a relationship. So most therapists listen to and respond to the subjective narratives of the person, or they listen to symptoms provided by the client. And this is what we've been trained to do when we're looking at higher level development. The person can tell us a whole set of stories that are meaningful, and they can list the symptoms, and the stories and the symptoms are their struggles with life are embedded in the stories of the symptoms, but they're simply not true with these lower level. The ones we call borderline, the central issues to borderline and lower level clients they're struggling with are not the stories, not symptoms, but relational issues that are minimally related to the stories and the concerns they have telling us about their partners, their children, their bosses, their work colleagues, their physical, addictive, symptomatic, or sexual issues. So they can tell us a whole lot of stories, but the stories are not going to be relevant to the relational issues that they need help with. Let's talk first about borderline. Borderline has been used over time, at least in English, to mean many different things. Originally, it meant borderline psychosis, and it described a person who looked normal or neurotic, but who from time to time would lapse into various kinds of psychotic episodes. But a major breakthrough in our thinking happened in Otto Kernberg's 1975 book called Borderline Personality Organization. It's one of the great classics of our field. And he defined borderline as essentially a relational problem that defied diagnostic definition. Now, the reason it defies diagnostic definition is because no matter how many criteria you list, as in the DSM, it's not going to give you a good picture of what the relational problem is, because every child and every mother set up different relational dimensions, and there are different relational issues. And there's no way we can summarize with a list of diagnostic criteria all of those infinite variety of possibilities. So we have to look at the relationship. So to speak of a way personality attributes are interpersonally organized, as Kernberg did, it's a totally different from the grossly simplified descriptive criteria of the that later emerged in the DSM. So we look in the DSM and there's 10 criteria, but you look at any one that we might see is at the symbiotic level, and the criteria may or may not fit very well. According to Kernberg, borderline, or people that are borderline, are thought to develop and to retain an organization of their personalities, certain fixed ways of experiencing relationships that originated in the symbiotic phase of development. And this word symbiosis came from Margaret Mahler in her 1968 book. And she defined the symbiosis. She borrowed a metaphor from biology. And she's very clear that it's a metaphor, and that because human beings, mothers and babies, are not in a biological symbiosis by any means, but between 4 and 24 months, they interact as if they're one, and so they both experience each other as an interacting pair. And so Kernberg's idea is there's an organization of the personality during that time that takes place through the relationship with the mothering person or persons. And as I've said before, now that we have young men more involved with the mothering process, we have different symbiotic structures forming with the fathers, grandmothers, aunts, uncles, and I always like to think of also the family dog. That is, the baby and the dog have to set up a way of interacting that works for both of them. The DSM being set aside by dynamic people, a different diagnostic manual was formed, the PDM, and you can't quite read here, but at the bottom, there are 6 associations, international associations of psychodynamic therapists that have gotten together and formed this manual, and it's very different than the DSM. I'm not recommending, it's very thick. I'm not recommending necessarily going to it, but I'm going to tell you why it's so different from the DSM. Following Kernberg, this manual defines borderline as between normal and neurotic and psychotic level of personality organizations. So here are the 3 levels that are spoken of in this PDM. Higher level, normal, neurotic, borderline are halfway between, higher, and lower level, psychotic, bipolar. Now, in my 4 levels, and in many other people who have 4 levels like I do, the level in here, of course, is the psychology of the self. But the self-psychologists did not participate much in this, or we might have 4 levels here. But the psychodynamic people have realized when we study relationships, we've got higher levels, lower levels, and mid-range levels. I'd like to talk just a bit about then the idea of content versus process treatment approaches. Content-centered therapeutic approaches to borderline and psychotic level personality organizations leave the therapist floundering with cognitive, behavioral, dialectical, and other symptomatic issues, which bypass completely what the client came to treatment for. That is, what I'm trying to say is these lower level people are essentially pre-verbal. Yes, 2-year-olds are learning words, but the essence of their being or the issue of their emotional problems has not yet come into words and stories. And so at the borderline level and the organizing level, they may talk, they may tell us a great many things, but that's not what they're there for. They're there because their relationships don't work well. So content therapeutic approaches fail because the issues that are giving these clients trouble originated in such early developmental period of their lives that there are no words, pictures, or stories to depict the problems. That is, there's no recognizable content. So we'll talk a little bit more about why the content is not very useful, but we have to listen to it and we have to give empathic responses to the content. But if we get lost in listening to the content, we get lost in how we can stay with the client. We have to stay with the client in a relational way. Let me give you a quick example here. There was a psychotic teenager who had been repeatedly hospitalized for serious behaviors and a series of suicide attempts. She was in therapy with a DDT specialist. She regularly regaled her therapist with an ongoing, she had a big journal, she wrote all these things, she did art, fantasy life. There were books of stories over a 3-year period. And so she told her therapist all of these wonderful things. But offhandedly one day, she explained that she frequently had trouble sleeping in a room by herself at night because she couldn't breathe. And at this point, we think, okay, we're finished with all the stories. We're finished with all the symptoms. Now she's saying, I have trouble sleeping because I can't breathe. There's no air circulation in here. So we're suddenly taken back to infancy and an infant who had a hard time breathing, perhaps because mother wasn't there, perhaps for other reasons. So in the middle of the night, she would go to her mother's room and sleep on the floor next to her mother's bed by a sliding door where she could breathe. She would decline mother's repeated invitations to get into her bed until she became freezing cold, and she finally crawled into mother's bed. But she reported, she had to be very careful not to get too close to mother, or she would become agitated. And what she meant was she would become fragmented. She would start to fall apart. That is, there's this need to get close to mother, but if she gets too close, she begins to fragment and fall apart. So she has to retreat. And this is the relational dynamic, the movement towards the other and the retreat from the other. But in all of the volumes of material that she had given her therapist, this had never become obvious. It's notable in this offhand comment of this young girl, it serves almost like a dream representation, lacking oxygen and warmth, but afraid of intimate connection. It came at just the point when her relationship with her therapist was deepening. So in the therapist notes, just a month or two before this was stated, the therapist began to feel that the relationship was improving. And so at this moment, we find the dynamic of the relationship. She's going to be afraid of her therapist. Furthermore, for 6 weeks now, she had been involved with increasing intimate relationship with a boyfriend. Now, she'd had plenty of sexual relationships, but this was more than a sexual relationship. It turned out to be that the boyfriend was really wanting an interpersonal relationship with her. So there again, the threat of personal relationships. Also, the previous weekend, a close friend had gotten married over the weekend, and some of her girlfriends and her friends were there, and she realized all of them had intimate relationships, and she wanted an intimate relationship, but she was afraid of them. So that all of the creative and voluminous content of the therapy missed entirely the in and out of the relational processes that were escalating terribly out of control towards a psychotic fragmentation. Knowing that the psychotic structures, she killed herself. And the reason I didn't supervise this case, the therapist that told me this story was in a very good, had been trained at a very good DBT institute, and was actually quite a good therapist, but she did not understand this organizing level. And so all of the content that she was talking about missed completely the relational process. And so after the young lady killed herself, a few weeks later, this therapist, whom I did not know, came and said, I understand that you might be able to help me understand what happened, that she killed herself. And she killed herself right when the therapy relationship was really going good. And there you have it. She's reaching towards the therapist, and right at that moment, she has to pull away. But the therapist was unaware of that dynamic. And so we lost the patient. Knowing that psychotic structures formed early in life are the product of trauma experienced in early intimate relationships can guide professional helpers in relationships to understand that not all people experience empathy, attunement, emotional resonance as good or safe. That is, as we've been trained in our university programs and in some of our post-university training, we're generally learned to be empathic with people. We learn to listen to careful, and we're trying to be emotionally tuned in with them or to resonate with our people. And that works very well with upper level people. But when it comes to the organizing people, that the promise of empathy or some interaction is terrifying. It's because in infancy, they, in their trust relationship with mothering persons, some trauma occurred such that every time there's the possibility of connecting, they have to pull back. This client's early and well-learned lesson was, it's best to stay immersed in fascinating content rather than to risk the terror of emotional relatedness. So all the content that she provided for her therapist did not help her. And neither she nor her therapist knew how to talk about the relational aspect of the therapy. The struggles of these borderline and psychotic individuals are predominantly relational and therefore become manifest in the way they relate to us and to the therapeutic setting. That is, these people cannot tell us what the trouble is. They can only show us by engaging us in a process of their own psychological lives. These experiences that happen before 24 months, there are no words or stories that tell it. Yes, 2-year-olds are learning words, but they're not putting words together with their experiences yet. And so they have no words, but they have experience and they have memories, but the memories are body memories. The memories are relational memories, emotional memories. And so we have to be able to tune in with them emotionally. We have to be able to resonate with them at an emotional level, but be aware that the minute we do start to resonate, they will become frightened. So we have a contradictory task. On the one hand, we want to draw people towards us so we can help them. But on the other hand, when they get too close, they're going to be traumatized and run away. And so it's like walking on a tightrope, trying to draw people towards us, but not too close that they become frightened and leave us. We can't completely avoid the content, of course, because content is the main thing these lower level people know to bring to us. So we engage as empathically as possible in the stories, symptoms, and issues that they tell us. But such empathic engagement is essentially a trust building and information gathering technique. That is, the stories, the symptoms are all they can do to tell us. We're listening, though, to the relational engagement. And yet, this is all that they can do is to tell us the content. All right. So we're listening to the content as an effort to build trust and safety. And with these people, trust and safety takes anywhere from 6 months to 2 years to establish, where the client is just safe coming to see the therapist and safe just talking with the therapist and is not going to feel threatened by the therapist coming too close or demanding too much. We know that the stories and the symptoms are not critical, rather, their relational issues are. So we must attend carefully to the ways these clients approach us and then try to make contact. And we must pay close attention to the kinds of interpersonal engagements. That is, every client brings different kinds of engagements because every client had different early engagements in the first year or two of life and different kinds of traumas. So every client's relational issues are absolutely unique. We might even say that effective treatment of the organizing and borderline level consists of these people coming to actually experience in the treatment situation itself with the therapist and in parallel relationships outside the treatment, they come to experience exactly how their personal styles of engagement and disengagement limit and set themselves up for relational problems. As people come to experience themselves in their habitual relatedness modes to the therapist, they then can see for themselves how limiting these modes actually are. Now, the empirical research that supports the PDM, the manual I showed you, the second manual, a lot of empirical research in it, it makes clear that successful psychodynamic therapy with borderline and psychotic level personality organizations spans a number of years. That is, in the PDM, it's very clear we can't do transformational therapy with these lower level people with less than a couple of times a week and several years. Now, that doesn't mean that short-term work can't be done, but the short-term work is done to simply get people back and functioning in their lives. But it's not, successful therapy takes a long time. Yet we know the majority of these people in lower level clinical populations are in economic or insurance position to obtain only short-term directive approaches. But whether the situation allows long-term or short-term, the relational lessons learned from long-term therapy can be decisive. Long-term work allows a slow motion video of the ways events that happen in a flash in a clinical setting. So even therapists who are working in a more short-term setting need to be familiar with the longer-term work, because the same things that happen in spread out in longer-term work can happen in an instant in any clinical hour. There's some engagement or disengagement. Now, notice today I'm talking mostly about psychodynamic therapy, but that's because that's been my particular orientation. But what we're aware of now is that the relational approach is being used, it's slowly being taken into all forms of psychotherapy. That is, it becomes clearer and clearer that the central piece of psychotherapy has to do with relationship. And so the things we're learning today will be valuable to you no matter how you were trained or what school of psychotherapy you were trained in. The therapist must be sharp enough to catch the relational dimension and quick enough to intervene effectively. So the strain on the therapist involves holding steady for long periods of time, just going slow, building trust by empathically responding to whatever content is offered, and then commenting regularly on the actual relationship engagements and disengagements in therapy and in outside relationships until the client gets the gist of how the here and now relatedness issues or what their relatedness patterns are important to them. Therapists, by being able to point to moments, either in therapy, out of therapy, when the person is moving towards a relationship, and moments in which the person is moving away, we begin to realize that the transference moment is right there. The transference is the terror of effective engagement and the need to pull away. So what we're constantly looking for, the transference being the centerpiece here, is we're looking for the way in which others, the therapist included, are being experienced as potentially very dangerous. Then after we begin to point those out and the client begins to catch on, the struggle, like a good parent encouraging a frightened child to walk or to ride a bicycle, or to engage in some other task, it takes time, the working through process. So the therapist needs to stand firmly and assisting on moving forward. Therapeutic victory slowly comes, but not without numerous demoralizing collapses and setbacks on the part of the client, with frequent periods of exasperation on the part of the therapist. And we're going to look at this process from several different angles. So first, let's think about relationship. When we think of psychotherapy as a relationship, an amazing convergence of minds, the new paradigm in neuroscience now teaches us that we are first and foremost a relational species. That is, modern technologies in neuroscience now reveal that our brains and our entire nervous systems, as well as our endocrine, hormonal, and neurotransmitter systems, they all organize themselves according to what kinds of relationships are and are not available earliest months of life. That is, much to our surprise, we began to realize that the earliest months of life, depending on the relationships that are there, the child is reaching in certain ways, and the parent reaches back in certain ways, and certain neurons fire. And according to Hebb, or the Hebbian principle, neurons that fire together wire together. So when there is a connection made between parental forces and the child, there is a neuron connection that holds in the child. And so these neuron connections are made during the first year of life. And by the 12th month, the structure of the brain is formed. That is, the scaffolding of the structure of the brain is formed. Neurons actually move around in the brain during that first year, but at some point there's a structure involved. And so between 12 and 14 months, billions of neurons are actively pruned out, killed off by the brain. That is, the structure that's there is now going to form the forward movement of the human being, and all of the other neurons that are there that have not been engaged in relationships are thrown out. Pruned is the word. Pruning, like you would prune a tree. You just cut branches off and throw them away. Billions of neurons in 12 to 14 months are pruned away. And so the structure of the child's mind and personality, the basic formation is there by the 12th and 14th month. Furthermore, we now know that our brains and nervous systems continue to generate neurons and new neurotransmitter pathways throughout our lifespan, according to the relational experiences that we have. Now, when I was in graduate school, we sort of thought the brain was just a thing that you were born with, and you learned to condition various responses, but neurons were not added. We didn't know much about neurotransmitters in those days, but now it's very clear that throughout the lifetime, depending on what kinds of relationships we engage in intimately, with partners, with children, with parents, with other people, with our patients, depending on what relationships we engage in, our neurons continue to reproduce themselves, but most importantly, neuronal pathways from neuron to neuron continue to generate throughout a lifetime. And so now this is why enlightened seniors, people over 50 or 60, are busy doing all sorts of things, new things, to stimulate the development of their brains. So they begin to form new social relationships, new groups, travel, anything to provide new and stimulating activities so that the brain continues to develop rather than become static and degenerates. These emerging neurological findings make clear that all emotionally intimate relationships, especially the psychotherapy relationship, hold forth the possibility of profound and enduring personality change. So at any time in a person's life, there is the possibility of profound change if the person is working at it and moving forward, working on expanding the mind. Another line of relational research comes from a massive task force set up by the American Psychological Association, Division 29, which is the psychotherapy division. They studied thousands of empirical studies of the outcome of psychotherapy, and they found a number of variables affect the long-term outcome. But the thing that came up again and again and again, the single most consistently important factor determining the overall outcome of all psychotherapies, all psychotherapies, is the relationship between the therapist and the client. What clients remember years later is not what their therapist said or did, but they remember the relational moments in which they experienced an emotional connection with and an emotional recognition from their therapist, a very real person. Further, the American Psychologist, in a recent survey reviewing hundreds of studies and thousands of psychotherapy client records, says empirical evidence that supports the efficacy of relational psychodynamic therapy. And but the thing that's becoming clearer and clearer, it's all therapy, so we don't have to limit it to psychodynamic. In addition, when the relationship has been the central piece, people continue to develop and get better years later. Some therapists choose to ignore the relational dimension, while other therapists focus centrally on it. But all highly skillful, seasoned professionals are acutely aware of what's going on in a relationship at all times and are carefully aiming their work into each as the relationship unfolds, no matter what school or theory of therapy they hail. I'm reminded I once watched Visenya Satir, a family therapist who works with systems therapy. She was going to do a sample family session in front of a large audience. There were several hundred people. It was in a gymnasium, so they were on bleachers and all this. And she's down in the center on a raised stage with the family, a mother and a father, a teenage boy, and a younger girl. And she's there, and she just starts like she would any family therapy session. And it goes this way and this way and this way. And she keeps directing her attention. The problem has been defined as the young boy. And he's sitting there with his head down. He's refusing to talk until at some point, Virginia bursts into tears. In front of all these people, she bursts into tears and she says, I'm trying my best to help you work things out with your parents, and I'm on your side, and you're not helping me. And the kid was shocked. I mean, he didn't expect that sort of emotional torrent from her, but he began immediately began to participate with her. And the family session went on in a very productive way because she was helping him express himself to the parents in ways that he had not been able to before. It was her emotional investment that changed the course of that hour. I have also watched behavior therapists work, and one time I had a chance to watch or hear Joseph Volpe report on a case, and this was a little girl, 6 or 7, whose symptom was she would cut out paper dolls, fold the paper, and then by the time it's folded, cut it in such a way that she'd have a string of paper dolls. She would do this all the time. It drove her parents crazy. It drove people at school crazy. And so she went to Wolpe, a behavior therapist, and he sat down on the floor with her. And she picked up paper and she began cutting out paper dolls. And so he talked with her about this and about this and about this. She still continued to cut out paper dolls. So at some point, he's a fairly large man and fairly aggressive. He stood up and lunged over her and said, "Stop cutting out paper dolls." And she did. Now, he realized that she was not given the emotional contact that she needed to help her stop this habit. And he wisely used his aggression to tell the child, to help the child stop. It was an interesting story. I once watched Alexander Lowen, the father of bioenergetics, a body psychotherapy, work. Now, body psychotherapists in their training typically get a group together and in the center, and sit in a circle. And in the center, the trainer comes and usually says a few words. So Al Lowen, who was a brilliant man, he's not with us now, but he was in the center and he talked a little while, and then he turned to the group and said, "Who wants to work?" Which is the invitation that who wants to have me work with their body a little bit right now. And so all the hands went up, and he looks and he points to a man on the front row. And as the man gets up, we realize he's a large, burly man. And as we learn a little about his history, he's an ex-cop, an ex-policeman who is very strong and very assertive. And he has actually killed several people with his bare hands in the line of policing duty. And so he's telling us about these. Meanwhile, Lowen is walking around him in a circle, looking at his body and watching everything. And then at some point, Lowen begins getting in his face and he moves right up to him And before too long, he's talking to him aggressively and he's hitting him on the chest. And at some point, the man bursts into tears and drops to the floor and says, "Father, Father, please stop hitting me." Lowen had guessed exactly what the problem was. And he knew it was a relational one. And so he moved in to reproduce the relational situation that he believed this man's body had been caught with all of these years. Each of these gifted therapists, working in their own way, demonstrates perfect emotional empathy under the circumstances. Even one of the founders of cognitive behavioral therapy, Aaron Beck, after reviewing the neuropsychological research, describes the personal crucial importance of relationship and of context and asserts. This is a quote from Aaron Beck. Quote, "The therapeutic relationship is a key ingredient of all psychotherapies, including cognitive therapy. Many of the basic interpersonal variables common to other psychotherapies, such as warmth, empathy, unconditional positive regard, many of these things serve as an important foundation for cognitive and symptomatic change." So even one of the leaders of cognitive behavioral therapy sees the importance of working relationally with people. Our conclusion then, since it is by now clear that relational variables are an essential and unavoidable part of professional work at all levels, it behooves us to fine-tune ourselves to the relational question. The relational question is always, what's going on here anyway? What's going on here right now? And that's the question that we have to always have in our mind, particularly when we're working with these two lower levels. What is happening here? Never mind what we're talking about. What's going on? The four different perspectives, I've told you about them, and we've looked at those charts, so you're familiar with those. From a developmental standpoint, we can say that the simplest relatedness modes are those that developed early in life, while the more complex ones require consistently more complex relational experience and learning. That is, bipolar, borderline, schizophrenic, and psychotic personality organizations are simpler relationally, and therefore, and the fears that go with them, therefore, in a certain sense, they're simpler for us to work with. I'm still talking back and forth between symbiosis and organizing. I'll go to the organizing in a minute. There's two intervention principles that are important in these early nonverbal relational level. The first one is the one we see at the organizing level. It's the engagement and disengagement. So all of these psychotic or lower level things, we're looking for the way the person engages a relationship and the way the person backs away. The second principle is the replication and disengagement from the symbiotic scenario. That is, in the borderline, we're looking for the way in which the person feels a need to replicate in the therapy relationship the earliest relationship, the character piece of the child. And the therapist has to kind of go along with it and learn. And we'll spend our whole next lecture will be on the how to work with symbiotic level patients. So the organizing experience, I'm going to launch into that. I've written 3 books on that. Working the organizing experience is the theory book with lots of little vignettes provided by many therapists. In Search of the Lost Mother of Infancy, there are 8 long-term treatment cases that are presented, and they're presented in case conferences with me teaching all the way along. So these are made up of verbatim. The conferences were recorded, and then so I'm teaching the theory of the organizing experience using long-term case studies. Then the third book, it comes along 6 or 8 years later, because I wasn't happy with the way I had been able to treat the actual working back and forth between therapist and client, the dynamics of the therapy. And so I asked my therapist, I sent out a letter. This is before emails, it's a 2000 book. I sent out a letter asking therapists that I knew that were working with psychotic patients, well, if you have a patient you could contribute to this book, let me know. And so 12 wonderful cases came up by 12 different therapists that are in this book. One of them is mine. And we look at the nuts and bolts of the back and forth of how to work with the organizing experience. Let's see. So identifying the organizing experience begins, it begins almost in the first session when we begin to notice how the patient is interacting with us and which are the closed off channels that the person keeps from engaging with us. I did a case conference this week in which we're in the 70th session, but for the whole 70th sessions, the person who was very bright and very talkative and very intellectual had been giving her therapist all kinds of content, stories, boyfriends, girlfriends, on and on and on. And the therapist was listening very carefully and very well. And at some point, there was a dream in which there was this friend of the patient who kept trying to correct her. And she was angry with the friend because she said, I don't want to be corrected. I just want empathy. And the therapist understood that all of her efforts to try to make sense of the content were not helping, that she just needed to be with the patient. And sure enough, in the following couple of sessions, the patient regressed into a full psychotic regression, which meant the therapy could really now begin. It was good. And so now the connection and the disconnection can be studied. But so long as she was going over all of her stories, the therapist had nothing to work with. So the earliest transference represents the learning, the experience of the child that whenever I reach out, I will not be met. And the rule, never go there again, becomes emblazoned in the neuron system. Don't ever reach that way again. And so then the person is stuck forever reaching, but never finding. That is, with people living organizing experiences, the transference structure can be seen as systematically functioning to limit or to prevent sustained human emotional contact. And if the person can't sustain emotional contact, then the learning experiences, emotional learning experiences, stop dead at the 4th or 5th month. The person learned as an infant that emotional contact is dangerous, frightening, traumatic, or life-threatening. Relatedness learning during the earliest months of life becomes organized around limiting the extension or reaching out experience and preventing all potential forms of contact felt to be frightening, unsatisfying, or unsafe. So that when a person learns early on to limit interpersonal connections, that person's opportunity for growth and learning likewise become systematically limited. A Jungian analyst, a friend of mine, Donald Kalsheim, who lives in New Mexico, he teaches that these terrifying transferences are frequently represented in dreams and fantasies as archetypal monsters and devils, or as guiding spirits and guardian angels. That is, we've compared our work, and while I have sort of a Freudian background and he has a Jungian background, we're on the same page when we look at these organizing level, but he talks about it in terms of archetypal monsters and devils that appear in dreams and fantasies, or guiding spirits or guardian angels. That is, the problem of contact. So both devilish angels serving to prevent later later interpersonal involvements, which have been known in the past to be traumatic. And Kalshade is fond of the Paradise Lost and points out that these people are waiting for Virgil to guide them through hell. Kalshade speaks of these devilish and angelic fixtures as an individual's self-care system that is served for a lifetime to keep the person suspended in a hellish limbo, awaiting a Virgil, a therapist, to guide him or her into the light of shared human experience. You can Google Donald Kalshade. He's got 3 books. They're all brilliant and wonderful, and but they do come at it from a Jungian perspective, which is a very different flavor, but we're dealing with the same thing. He is the Jungian therapist who internationally is the leader of the people dealing with psychosis. I have 3 case examples, and I'm going to hold them for now, seeing how our time comes out. So I want to talk about disconnecting modes. And the word that I used some time ago is clamor. Can some of you here in the studio, what is the Chinese translation for clamor? Do you know?
生气.
Okay. The idea is that a child is not getting her needs met. And first she begins to cry a little and fuss a little, and then she begins to breathe heavily and flail her arms and kick and scream and yell. She's clamoring. She's making a large, obnoxious mess, trying to signal all of her needs. Now, if the environment comes through to respond to these needs, then there's no clamoring. But what happens then is that the child who is not responded to in the organizing experience learns that clamoring serves to push people away. So what starts off as a legitimate cry for help, then once the cry reaches a clamoring, loud, obnoxious level, the organizing person begins to learn that the louder I make noises, the farther I'm going to keep people away from myself. Over the years, I've come to stigmatize various disengagement modes as emanating from the organizing transference as the clamor of the therapy hour. In English, clamor is a pejorative term. When we talk about somebody clamoring, we don't like it. But I chose that word because the organizing people learn to clamor to keep people away. All right, I've already said that. All right. Subsequently, the clamor is systematically paired with or conditioned to a sense of the presence of the mother who is failing to relieve the perturbation or the pain. Thus, through simple conditioning, later trust relationships become objects of terror in proportion to whatever extent they were originally unsuccessful in quelling the rising tide of overwhelming distress and pain. Notice here, I'm talking about trust relationships. Psychotherapist is certainly a trust relationship, but there are other trust relationships that people experience in childhood and adulthood. I'm thinking of children that have a choir director or a Girl Scout leader, or a camp director, or later a club director. So there are a lot of relationships in which so often these organizing people, the compassionate adults, pick up that this child has got some difficulty and they try to approach and be good to the child. And so as the child begins to establish a closer relationship with this person, a teacher, a choir director, whomever, the child then begins to become frightened of it. So this process happens in many other places in our society, but we're aware of it, of course, as happening in psychotherapy. Later trust relationships then are imbued with this conditioned fear and its accompanying clamor. The clamor thus serves as an alienating wedge between people to prevent the danger of intimate relating. Clamorous content or behavior thus becomes a conditioned method of averting the challenge necessarily posed by interpersonal engagements. Oops. Clamor then, or the cluster of symptoms, the person, I've got this wrong, I've got this wrong, I've got this wrong, I'm having trouble with this man, I'm having trouble with this woman, going all these stories that go on and on. It takes many different forms, but in therapy, it serves to produce a breach in the interpersonal connection or limit the possibility of satisfying and sustained connections. In the example I gave you a few minutes ago of a very fine therapist who was working with an organizing personality for 70 sessions, she reported in the countertransference she was frequently bored or sleepy in it because the person wasn't relating to her. The person was just telling her stories, going over her symptoms, how many times she went to the hospital, how many doctors she had seen, but none of it was related to or with the therapist. Lily, I see you're shaking your head. You know about this. So later I'm going to ask you to give us an example, okay? Therapists with good training and empathy try in the therapeutic process to write out the cry that like this therapist did. You try to just be there and let it go on and on and on. You empathize with the whole need, but what you become inevitably frustrated because your needs to have a decent therapy relationship are being thwarted. So this is very hard on therapists. But empathy with only the content often serves to escalate the intensity, delay its punch, and reaffirm its alienating function. That is, the more, if we empathize only with the content, it gets louder and louder because it's working. The content of the clamor cannot be satisfied because, as cry, it is a memory with a purpose, but not a relevant content. Okay? The cry, the clamor, is a memory with a purpose. The purpose of trying to bring the parent, and then at some point, trying to hold the traumatizing parent back. So the memory is a body memory, it's an emotional memory, but all the things that people use to try to give us content can't express what's truly important. The purpose is to prevent or forestall empathic and personal contact, which is transferentially perceived as dangerous. I want to keep emphasizing we have different kinds of transference that exist at these 4 different developmental levels. And in my charts, I go through and try to define what those are. But at this level, the transference is that moment in which the person is moved towards the therapist and then begins to feel an emotion and some empathy or some resonance. And that means there's a trust relationship. And in my first trust relationship, I was hurt or injured, and I've learned to flee from those trust relationships. So the question that we often say is, why do these people keep approaching the therapist? Why do they keep approaching other people? The answer is surprisingly simple. All mammals are genetically programmed to find the warm body or die. Each mammal species forms attachments in a different way, but if a mammal doesn't find its mother, it's going to die. And so human children with 40 million years of human evolution, human children come into the world genetically prepared to find a warm, a connecting mother and to feel connected and then go into the symbiosis and then begin to develop a self and then begin to into the social order. And they're genetically prepared to behind the mother stands the father and the family and the church, the religion, the tribe, the culture, the language. All of these things have evolved over millions of years, and the child is genetically prepared to move in to all of these levels of complex attachment and to finally move into cultural and linguistic forms, as we see happen in the 5-year-old level. The 5-year-old level, it's immature, but it's there, the capacity. So since the child is genetically programmed to find this, if the child instead finds either hurt or nothing, the child then pulls back. And so the child is forever left as a mammal searching for the warm breast. But the minute there's the possibility of some milk, some feeding, the child must pull back. That's the moment of transference. So what we're always looking for with all of these organizing levels, no matter what the symptom, whether they're schizophrenic, bipolar, autistic, what we're always looking for is the moment in which they pull away. Now, I don't mean to preclude the possibility that that there are some forms of genetic or birth defects. There certainly are. Children are born with different kinds of defects in all parts of their bodies. So certainly some of these people at the psychotic level have some kind of a defect. But the thing that's becoming clearer to us now is the vast majority of these people, whether schizophrenic, bipolar, autistic, schizoid, they're dynamically formed through this terror of connecting with the outside object. So the content of the clamor can't be satisfied. The purpose is to prevent connection. The clamor is an angry memory. That's an important thing. All these stories and symptoms are presenting to the therapist an angry memory of what I needed and did not get. But the conditioned clamor memory now functions in the service of preventing intimate or reciprocal interconnections that in the past were known to be traumatic. The clamor expresses the fear of re-traumatization in the present trust relationship and seeks to prevent or foreclose a relationship from happening. What is remembered is the pain of a previous relation or connection that was experienced as hurtful, dangerous, or terrifying. And so what we have to accept in our role of therapist is that while our people may come towards us, may idealize us, may tell us we're the most wonderful people in the world, blah, 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 okay, at some point, they're going to be terrified of us. And so we have to be prepared to be experienced as terrifying objects, as doing dangerous and frightening things to them. Sammy, I thought you raised your eyebrow, and therefore I could tell you don't like me, that you want me dead. That's the way these come off, that we can do the slightest thing, but because they're bringing a transference to it, expecting you to hurt me, then you can do anything, and that hurt will be projected onto you as the therapist. Either passive withering dysfunction or muscular constriction serves to ward off the anticipated trauma. Successful, going to the bottom here, successful relational therapy eventually involves re-experiencing the agonizing pain and learning to release it. That is, we can't talk people out of their psychotic symptoms. We can't talk people out of their stories, their symptoms, because what's going on has nothing to do with talking. It has to do with being, with experiencing, with emotional connection and emotional disconnection. And so they have to actually, in the therapy with us, go back to these primitive emotional experiences of fear, fright, and terror in order to re-experience the trauma with an adult mind. In summary, the trust relationship itself mobilizes regressive, conditioned, physical, psychological pain responses. The symptomatic cry or clamor serves to ward off present and future connections by alienating the person of others, thereby creating a safety zone to prevent anticipated recurring relationship trauma. In Kalshed's Jungian terms, the primitive self-care system has been effectively mobilized and is often represented as monsters, devils, guiding spirits, or guardian angels. Let's see. All right. I'd rather, one of the things that we hear so often in a variety of forms is abandonment. That is, and I've thought about that for a long time, because abandonment is really properly experienced at the symbiotic level. That is, you can't be abandoned unless you are connected. And these people never got connected. But the experience of abandonment is something that everybody on the planet knows. And we all know that it's painful. So these people at this organizing level, in one way or another, they often are saying, you're not doing it right, you don't listen to me. 1,000 different complaints about the therapist. And it's always, you're not with me, you're not doing it right. But as a clamorous cry, these abandonment things are essentially bogus because it's used to promote, to keep ways of keeping the therapist away. So the clamorous abandonment cry serves to prevent connections or to stop connections. So so the whole idea of abandoning, you're not with me, you're not doing it right, we have to realize that's part of the clamor, and we don't need to respond to that. We can say, I can tell that you're very angry with me, that I'm not doing this right. But it seems to me that the important thing is that you're angry with me, and I'm feeling your anger, and that feels good. And then in a moment, the person changes the subject, and then we point out that they've left the time. I gave you these in the last one. Okay. The abandonment, the organizing level plea is always somehow, don't abandon me, I need you. But as a clamor, it functions to push people away. All right. Summary then here of what we said so far. The term organizing refers to the fundamental activity of organizing a channel or pathway or link to another human being, and that organizing experience starts actually with conception. The zygote is searching for the womb, and then for 9 months there's a search and an organized trying to find all the different things in mother's body, and then at birth trying to find things in mother's arms. And so the organizing experience fails to take by virtue of unresponsiveness or faulty responsiveness of the human environment. And it aborts by virtue of the conditioned pain that prevents ongoing reciprocity. Let's see, okay. I've got one more metaphor I want to give you. And I've got it written here in the slides, but I'm just going to tell it to you. It's the energy metaphor. Zilli, you're sitting over there and I'm here. And where you're sitting or sometimes standing, you're grounded. You're safe, you're on the ground, and I'm here safe and I'm on the ground. And I throw something to you, a thought or a comment, and you take it in and throw something back. And I throw something else to you and you throw it back. And so we're going back and forth in an exchange of energy because we're each one grounded, and there's an arc, like an electric arc, that runs between us that keeps us connected. And so when we think about connections, we can think about an energy arc that goes back and forth between two people who are engaged with each other. So the question would be, if an organizing person needs in some way or another to break this or prevent this arc, where is it going to happen? Well, the most obvious place is somewhere between us. That is between you, Zilli, and me. We're just starting to connect, and the person turns their head away or changes the subject or has to go to the bathroom or needs to leave the session. Anything to stop this energy arc so that we don't connect, because I'm terrified that if I connect with you, you'll hurt me. But there's other places along this arc that can be broken. The first place is in my body. I'm the patient. And instead of connecting with you and keeping this energy arc going back and forth, I can break it by becoming preoccupied with my body. My fibromyalgia is flaring up. I suddenly have a headache. I'm thinking about how I can't sleep, or one thing or another after another, but body preoccupations take me here and stop the energy arc because I'm no longer, I may be telling you stories about my body or my illnesses, but I'm not connecting with you about them. Freud lets us know that any theory of psychosis has got to account for hypochondriasis. That is why people become preoccupied with their body. And the answer at this point in time is very clear, so as to stop the energy arc of the connection. But there's another place where this arc can be broken, Zilly. You know, I sued my last therapist. I filed a formal legal complaint. Did you feel the break? Did you feel suddenly Zilly's body feels the break? It's like he's suddenly shocked. And I've gotten him thinking about is he safe? Is he safe from me? What's he doing? And so the energy arc can be broken. So if I need to stop connections or to prevent them from coming, I can stop them between us, within me, within Zilly, by what I say or how I relate. And so it becomes very interesting to watch the way people break the contact there. Let's see. Uh, in my books, I've talked a great deal about therapy with the organizing experience, but I've really given you the answer already in the sense that what we have to do is we have to be present for a long time until there's safety. And then what we have to do is find ways of showing the person the transference of when they're connecting and disconnecting. And we do that in any way that we can do it. And that's the course of the therapy. So those are basically the elements of the organizing experience. So we have a few more minutes, and we stop sharing here. I'm interested in questions. Can you start us off, Sammy?
我们现在剩下12分钟的这样子一个 Q&A 时间，那麻烦老师们提问了。
I feel that I like the
Okay, Sarah, a little closer to your microphone. Yes.
Okay. I feel I like the idea of glamour. That's very helpful idea and conception for me. At the same time, I'm delighted with you use the word like the condition, the pain to describe something in transference is the repetition of the trauma. Because it is like we have internalized some pain, and whenever the relationship gets closer, so the conditioned pain occurred, and then the patient would try to push away because we are so afraid to be re-traumatized again. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. And where we're going to talk specifically about that internalization process is in the 10th lecture, which is studying the problem of suicide. Because what we have there is an internalization of a parent not wanting the child. Okay. And so we'll look at that in lecture 10, but you've said it very well in that regard. Lily, I warned you I was going to try to get an example from you. Do you have one?
Yeah, I just think of many patients, some process of the conversation when listening to the clamor of the therapy hours. I just remember just recently a patient who told me how suffering she was, and when in lockdown, because she has to stay with the whole family all day and all night, and that really makes her very anxious. And so, after she told me something very annoying and very terrible, and I was very curious about the details. So I just asked one question about, like what's going on there. And then she cried. And she said, do not ask me question. I just need your empathy.
Go away.
It's exactly what you mentioned about
Yeah.
the clamor.
Yes.
Yeah, I just feel that part is very difficult, and I completely agree with the sympathy is not enough at that
No.
time.
No.
Yeah.
It's not. Yeah. That was a great example. Thank you. Because just at the point that you're reaching out with empathy or asking for an engagement, that's when she says no. And she cried. So it seems so authentic, like she's really telling you that something important, but all she's doing is pushing you away. So Summer, do you have a question for us? No question, Summer? How about you, Lily? Lily Zhang.
Yeah, yes, I have a question. And one comment at first. So I also feel the clamor concept is very useful to me. When I listened, I thought of many difficult cases of mine. So I think maybe sometime I focused more on the content announced in the contents,
Yes.
but the clamor metaphor itself is it's very helpful. Yeah, and the question is about the last part. You had the metaphor of the the body. The body work. So
the hypochondriasis.
Yes.
The focusing on body parts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I took part in some courses of the body therapy also, but I just felt, it's not for me. The body work and my psychodynamic work, sometimes I could not combine it in a very good way. But just when working with very difficult patients, myself, I may have some countertransference, body countertransference.
Yes.
So, so my question is about how do you work with the body issue? Do you combine some body work?
Usually not, because my training is psychoanalytic, and I've done also body training, and I've also been several years in body therapy. So, but I'm basically more comfortable on myself staying with the thing that I've done for so many years. But I'm very sensitive to the body. So as people begin breathing or tapping their feet or whatever it is, I generally, I pay attention, and I might or might not call their attention to it. Because why? Because if their body is speaking at that moment, but I say, well, what's going on with your feet? They seem like they're kicking. Then I may be making the person self-conscious about their feet, and I'd rather wait a little while to see what evolves. But body therapists move right in. But I've supervised a number of body therapists who wanted some psychodynamic training as well. And the general opinion of the body therapists that I worked with is one has to be very careful with the body at the organizing level. That is, body therapists generally have an informed consent for touching and doing this and this and this. But physical touching is extremely intimate. And so body therapists are not wanting to put their hands on an organizing person because you're pushing into the trauma area. Rather, they will begin by breathing together, taking deep breaths together, and possibly a brief finger on the forehead. But it takes a long time to build the trust before the body work can be done. So it's just that body work moves one more quickly into intimacy than simply talking. And so it's careful. I would like to tell one quick story before we start, how we discovered this. Dolly Platt, a psychologist from Israel, was in one of my study groups, and we had 12 people in this study group, all of whom were treating someone who was psychotic. And Linda Reed was presenting a case that she was working with. And Linda Reed, in addition to being a therapist, was also a yoga instructor. And so this woman wanted to do yoga also with her. And Linda was a little concerned, but Linda did a little bit of hands-on work in the yoga work, but she could always see that it wasn't good for this patient. So she began to talk the patient down, let's not do that. And so the patient basically decided, no, we're not going to have a treatment, was what the patient called it. So one day the patient, after we've gotten this all settled that we're not going to do body work, one day the patient comes in and says, I need a treatment today. So, and we're all listening to these process notes that Linda is presenting to us in this group. And Linda then begins very empathically trying to explain once again why I don't think that our treatments are helpful. And we're all sitting there because Linda was a very empathic therapist. She was giving this beautiful, beautiful speech. And all of a sudden, the heavens opened up, clouds billowed out with golden lining, and the jeweled sword of God landed directly on Linda's head with the words, "This is the therapist for you." Now we're all sitting there thinking, what? And we're thinking, well, she just did this very empathic thing. But we're stunned. So feel the connection? She tried to connect. Dolly Platt jumps up and said, that was not a connection, that was a disconnection, that was a hallucination. She left the therapist right now and hallucinated God and a sword. And this was her way of taking the therapist, blocking the empathic connection. And that's when we first saw the organizing experience. It was in that moment that we realized that what was being afraid of was the empathy, and it would immediately produce whatever psychotic symptoms the person might have. So, Sammy, are we about finished?
Yes, we are. We're right on time.
Okay,
and would
perfect.
you please just stay for a few minutes after the class?
All right, perfect.
Thank you.
All right.
好，
Let's see. Okay.
那谢谢各位老师，我们下周见。
Okay.
Thank you. Thank
All
you.
right. All right. Thank you all for being here. See you next
Thanks.
week.
Yeah,
See you.
Bye.
All right. All right.